The Culture and Animals Foundation. Think, create, explore, celebrate.
Why were you drawn to writing about female primatologists in particular?
I was really interested in thinking about how these understandings and ideas of entanglement and interconnection with humans and non-humans emerged, and I was wondering about which historical moments we might be able to point to, where that kind of thinking, originally arose. And one of them that seems particularly important to me was this moment in the 1960s and the 1970s when female primatologists, particularly folks like Jane Goodall, Birute Galdikas, Dian Fossey, were doing this very public-facing field work where they were writing, National Geographic articles, appearing on television and film, and they were these big stars in the scientific community, but they were advocating for a very different kind of science, a very different way of knowing non-humans, one that was based upon habituation, these kind of this long-term attempt to get to know another animal. In their case, chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans. But it was a very different kind of model from the previous one, where a bunch of guys would go out and they would, kill a primate and then they would study them. There was very little attention given to the actual environments and the actual social relations that constituted these groups. And so there was a sharp departure. And so these primatologists were interested in modern ideas of conservation. They were concerned about the killing that was going on. They wanted to find more equitable ways of doing their science. And in doing that, they also, I think, were producing different kinds of knowledge. And so that moment was really interesting for me, and it was one that I wanted to study and think with as kind of an opening part of the book, and also then as a chapter. So I'm using it as kind of a historical moment to think about how these bigger ideas of interconnection emerged in the United States, and then also kind of were situated within a broader global context. A context, of course, that's also bound up with, histories of colonialism.
What do you think was the significance of this shift, both in terms of the history of science, the history of ethology, and animal advocacy?
Yeah, if you're thinking about the longer history of ethology, and you're thinking about even the longer history of animal behavior science, that moment marked a break from the way that science was done before, in many ways. And it's not to say that every biologist or ecologist even studies, in this way or thinks about long-term studies like that. But it's to say that this was a historical moment in which primatology became reoriented around questions of consent, of how knowledge itself is produced, which was a departure. I think before it was kind of understood that knowledge is extracted from non-humans, from research subjects, and that's how knowledge is gathered and then it's thrown out into the world, right? And in particular, scientists are the ones who were tasked with disseminating knowledge, and so it was these kind of inner circles. But from that moment, it marked a shift in thinking about how knowledge is produced and then also how knowledge is disseminated. One can be an expert, but can also be a public-facing expert. Can talk to broader publics and share the findings. One can also then share the impacts of the kind of relationships, right? So I think that one of the things that we see is that folks like Goodall or Fossey, as you had noted, were very interested in thinking about and talking about the actual feelings that arose from their research, as opposed to kind of hiding that away. I think that we can see a bigger shift in ideas about objectivity and subjectivity that are coming out of that work. One where instead of thinking about the scientist as this like bounded objective individual who's just out in the field to get information and then to leave, scientific practice became marked by different affects and different orientations to non-humans. Ones that accepted and kind of recognized the fact that, well, this work is meaningful and this work is really dependent upon um, forms of interconnection and long-term relationship building rather than just this kind of extractivist mode of doing science. With primatology, there's a connection to anthropology and like a significant interest in thinking about how human societies came to be through their evolutionary histories, and then also to think just about how these things like culture, even like relationship building, how that emerges within human societies. Primatologists also influence the anthropological disciplines. If we look at feminist science studies and its articulation as a field, I think that some of those early ideas that were kind of articulated in the 1970s and 1980s about science as this constantly unfolding and interconnected project that includes non-humans. I think that we see that happening as early as the 1960s with Jane Goodall's research. I think she was articulating some of those things, and it's not to say that she was, her politics were always the same. They were certainly different in that context. She made like many remarks about um, how men were like better at various things in the field, for example, than women, things like that. But it's to say that I think some of those ideas came out of that moment and shaped the kind of future workings of primatology, of anthropology, and also just of animal studies in general. Once habituation happens with a group, then that becomes passed down and inherited. And so, like, once you're in as a researcher and they're familiar with you and there's this trust that's been built up, suddenly, the pathway is open. So I'm really interested also in these kind of contexts. That makes me think of like the context where we have these long-standing research projects that have been going on for many decades now, and Goodall's is one of those examples. But it asks, I think, the new researchers who are getting involved with that work to have a different kind of relationship to those animals.
What would you say you learned about narrative in general and narratives about primates in particular from your research?
So narrative's a key part, as you know, about the work that I do. So I'm really interested in the way that stories of the self can position and reconfigure the liberal subject and kind of displace that subject by instead reaching out to and thinking about modes of interconnection, in particular like reciprocal relations between humans and animals, humans and plants, and then also other beings. And so in this case, if we're thinking about habituation as this kind of as a process that occurs within science, it's also one that produces particular articulations of selfhood that are then picked up and described in narrative. Narrative becomes this vehicle for talking about entangled, interconnected modes of being. But asking that question, how does narrative produce different ways of being and different modes of the self that may in turn disrupt and challenge the kind of liberal humanist formations that we have, where the self is this kind of autonomous, disconnected, universal, body that's granted subjectivity. How might we think about that in different ways? And then in turn, how might that get us to different formulations of justice and different ways of thinking about juridical systems and structures and ways of being that are hopefully more just.
What's next for you in your work?
The book project, mostly. With the book, I have a proposal done, so it's a kind of a first step, so that I can pitch it to presses. And then I have drafts of 3 chapters that are now put together. I need to write 2 more chapters and then finish the other drafts. And so I'm hoping to do that in the next year or 2. But I'm really interested in disrupting liberalism, liberal humanism, and in particular the subject that it articulates, and how that subject then figures within justice and also legal structures. And so I want to think more about modes of entanglement and interconnection that are premised upon ideas of reciprocity. And so I'm really interested in these personal narratives. A lot of this is drawing, again, on that research that I had done earlier with these primatologists. And so that's an attempt to break away from the kind of separation that happens between humans and others. And it's also an attempt to think critically about how historically disadvantaged communities have been erased and kind of elided by juridical systems and by legal frameworks, and instead to bring them back into the conversation. And so I'm really curious to ask the kind of question about, well, what would the world look like if instead of these liberal humanist frameworks that really are dependent upon division and separation, and also producing a certain kind of human, a kind of human that's above everything else and above other forms of humanity or of humankind. Like, what would it look like to have these modes of being that are based upon interconnection? If we recognize that humans and non-humans need one another in order to exist, what kind of worlds can come out of that? I mean, it's not only a project about including and incorporating non-humans into human lives, but instead it's a project about completely rewriting and restructuring like what it means to be in this like very fundamental sense. The discussion of affect needs to come in when we're thinking about justice, and right now it's not. And so a lot of these things, these are feminist ways of thinking, relationality and affect and kind of interconnectedness, right? It comes out of all these different feminist lineages. Um, but I think that question of how these relationships make us feel is an important one, and I think it's one that is also going to be a necessary part of multi-species justice as it's thought about and as it's formulated.
The Culture and Animals Foundation. Think, create, explore, celebrate.